think it goes again back to that whole thing of having to maybe look into why is it that we feel we need to hold on to something that is naturally evolving in order for our spirituality to actually have meaning and be real to us.
In the last episode, when I was speaking to Gogo about dealing with spiritual setbacks, there's something that stuck with me, and that is, in the process of dealing with spiritual setbacks or with spirituality in general, there's a way in which we use language that kind of heightens our experience of it. For example, if I say that izinto zami azihambi kahle, there's an underlying sense of something deeper than when you say something like things are not going well for me. There's a way in which our languages capture spiritual concepts in a way that English actually can't, and there's a lot of things that either can't be translated or cannot be translated well into English. Here's another example. For me, the word ancestors doesn't fully translate into Ihlozi. There's a lot that gets lost in the translation, and not only that, but there's a lot that gets misconstrued in the process. But the reality is that if you look at our younger generation, even children at creche, you will see that our languages are on the decline, or at the very least, they are evolving. And we already have living evidence of this change because it has been happening even when we were still young. Here's a personal example. I am Xhosa, but the Xhosa language and its culture were totally alien to me for the vast majority of my life because of where I grew up, where the predominant language was Setswana and the dominant culture is a kind of hybrid mix of bits and pieces of different cultures, as is the case with most places in Gauteng. So what identity do I carry? And in the context of this topic, what is my spiritual identity, and how does the language that I have been speaking since birth, the language that is so far removed from my actual culture, how does it impact or affect my spiritual identity? Here's a much more practical example. I learned the word umsamo about 5 or 6 years ago. Actually, no, where I'm from, the word umsamo means a pillow, like something that you sleep on. But the Nguni word itself is relatively new to me, and not only is the word new to me, but the context of it is also very, very new to me. When I was growing up, whenever there was umsebenzi somewhere, there would be a place within the yard where the ceremony is happening, where there would be a little setup of snuff and umqomboti and some tobacco, all of which would be put on like a newspaper. It was generally in a random place, like near the gate or by the wall next to the driveway, or it would be in a dining room next to the contraption that holds all of Gogo's most precious plates, or it would be in a bedroom next to a kisti of some kind. And most of the time, when the ceremony is over, that space essentially disappears. It gets put away. The idea of umsamo being a permanent space within a home dedicated to connecting with the guides of that family is something that I'm really, really new at. So my question to myself, or rather I should say my assumption, is that if I had known the meaning of the word, just the meaning, it would have taught me a huge aspect of African spiritual practice and belief. This is just an assumption that I'm making. So in the process of the change of evolution of our societies, how does language affect our relationship with spirituality? to understand this better, I spoke to Gogo Khanyakude, who is a healer, a gobela, and someone that I believe is one of the most important voices of our generation when it comes to the modern interpretation of African spirituality. Which is basically around how language affects our spirituality. Because the broader context is that our languages are evolving, right? We are speaking more mixed languages. And I want to say people who are purists would say that, Idlozi only speaks your language. If you are Mzulu, Idlozi only speaks isiZulu. If you are this, they only speak that. But some people are like, no, you can say anything, some people say you can mix. So I want to understand the broader impact of language, especially in how we interact with spirit on a daily basis, in terms of, are we using the right language? Is there a right language? And how do we use that language on our daily life? So to start off with, I want to speak about you personally. How did you get to you speak a lot of languages? You speak a lot. Like, I think you speak all the languages except sign language, ne?
Venda.
Okay. All right. How did you get to speak so many different languages?
It's always curious for me, and I think that, one of my favorite, Emerson quotes is that, first we shape the environment, then the environment shapes us. So I could say that I can attribute a lot of it to my environment. I'm coming from a mother who has Swati, Shangaan, having Bulana, and a multicultural sort of a lineage, Limapai. It's sort of, there's that connection also with Ndao people, and then people also from Malawi. So there's that whole thing in the generations of having that as an inheritance. And then from a paternal, also having Batu Bama Pulana, Bama Pedi, Babesutu, Babang Kimakaranga. So all of those things are on a genetic level encoded within me. So I guess that how it showed up in my conditioning is that having then access to maybe my paternal grandmother, they speak Sepulana. So when I'd go there, I would speak Sepulana. On my maternal grandmother's side, they spoke Swati. So those were the two languages that I interacted with. But also with the understanding of Mpumalanga being bordering Swaziland and Mozambique. So there's also then the influence of, what is your Shanganu, your Tonga, your Ndao people that also are there. So there's an exposure also to that as a language. And then coming from a bloodline that is multicultural, which is also multilingual. So the interest and the ability to learn languages is there. So I've always had an interest in languages. Growing up, I pick up languages easily. And if I spend time with you in a week, I will be able to start to have conversations and to start to understand, because I am very curious about communication as well, because that's also something that's very central to my gifting, is that one of being a voice and being able to communicate.
Okay. And in if you can think back to the beginning of your spiritual journey, and when I say beginning, I mean you sort of embarking on becoming a healer. How did language play a role in how you were interacting with the process? And I mean this in the context of there's a general understanding that different modalities are grouped according to culture, and therefore they are grouped according to languages. There's the Nguni way, there's the the Tsonga way, there's the Sotho way. How did language sort of impact how you were engaging with the different parts of your journey?
That's actually such an interesting conversation, and one that I hadn't actually ever thought of in reflecting upon my journey. And I guess what I can attribute it to is that now we live in the era where, there's beautiful podcasts like yours. I have a YouTube channel. There's all of these platforms where people can learn around, the protocols, if we could say, or, the cosmology of our spirituality, and with the practices, the customs, and all of those things. For me, when I went into it, there weren't so many resources. What was happening was that I finished varsity in high school in 2008. Wasn't able to finish varsity, wasn't able to keep a job, wasn't able to have any focus. I was drifting. It was like literally when they say you're like a tree without roots, I was like everywhere. Until I started to have these intuitive messages that I have something spiritual going on. When it all started to come, to the fore was when a prophet said, I carry the spirit of my great-great-grandfather who comes from my paternal side, who Nensalingakachupe, which is Ligedla, he naturally had a gift of understanding media and everything, but also was a prophet. And I was supposed to have gotten his name, etc. That was the entry point. So that to me is my Pulana side, it's my paternal side. What then was discussed was, I must go to church to see if we can convert it into Moya. And then from there, I went into trance for the first time. The Ngunis came out, they spoke what they spoke, around, I've been saying I have a calling, and because everybody's been doubting, I actually should go where I have been saying I need to go. And the Ndawas also came out and spoke. And that then began the journey of going to my father's side, going to go and Pasha. So the interaction with the language then was, because I went to Rakadi and Rayakoma Bitling, the pastor Pulani. So, but it wasn't I have to speak in this language, or I have to.
How was that for you when you found out that you have to, or rather you felt compelled to? This is how.
For me, because my calling was an intuitive one. Okay. Because a lot of my gifts center around a sort of a psychic gift, with one of the main ones being the gift of claircognizance, of just knowing things, or intuiting into things, or sensing into things, or feeling into things. So it's an experiential. For me, I've always been a very headstrong person. If I said I'm going to do X, Y, Z on this and this day, and it was 10 years, in 10 years on that day I will do it, and I will remind everyone that this is it. So even when I got all of these intuitive messages, and I would say that I need to initiate, I feel I need to twasa, the prophet then saying that, and then the trance happening was a validation for me. So the feeling would then have been one of validation, because everyone around me couldn't accept that I had a calling, because I didn't have dreams, I wasn't physically ill. There weren't any of the typical omens that could be attributed to impau or signs of having a calling, except what I said.
Sure.
So that feeling of, relief, that feeling also gave me this rise into then being like, okay, now I'm going to be more committed to following what this voice is saying. And what is interesting though is that thinking around the voice or the intuition or the feeling, when it communicated to me, it never doesn't communicate in a specific language I can trace, except of one that is known. Because at times I will speak in English, times it will be in whatever language comes to me. But it's more of a felt thing, which is embodied more than spoken and communicated.
In that time, were there ever incidences or moments where they said that you have to speak in this language because this is the particular person that you're speaking to? Then this spirit spoke this particular language, so you have to speak that language to them.
So it's interesting that you say that, because I'm giving a context as to, how from before I went to Twasa, there wasn't an interaction with the language. Because language also is the portal to our identity.
Yes.
because language is tied to the land, is tied to a people, is tied to a history. We as an African people come from an orature, an oral culture. So it means language also is, a way of unlocking our historical offices, right? So when I got into EP31, because I grew up, and up until probably I was in my 20s, I hardly spoke any African language. I could speak African languages, but I intentionally didn't. I would sooner, because I did French in varsity, je ne parle vous un petit peu français, Sure. I even would go as far as rather speaking Yoruba, because I've always loved languages, but I completely was disassociated from my South African languages. And it wasn't necessarily based on just the European. I had interest in other African languages, just not our own. So getting into Twasa, they're like, yo, so you are very white, you are the Huarish, and that's going to create issues for you. And I immediately felt as though, but why am I being judged? Because I'm here, I'm so excited, and from my life experience, anything I commit to, I would do very well. And what was explained to me was that because the language is not my main language, Swati, and the languages of my ancestors, I'm going to struggle to understand to the indigenous knowledge and the traditional or ancient wisdom that is encoded within the language, because I have to learn, the language around ukuthi masikhuluma ngokuthi imbawu yini, because words like imbawu, kuvivinywa, uyabona, imbacambili, all of those magulube, all of those language words which we use in Edlotini, Mutuesnguni, to me were very unfamiliar, because I spoke a conversational Swati and not like this Judid. So also it meant that because I spoke a conversational one, I wasn't exposed a lot to the customs and cultures which would have given me that deep grounding and rooting into the indigenous practices. So what was identified was that my lack of having a understanding or lived like desire to speak these languages locks me out from understanding Isintu, and because of that would make my journey into connecting with my ancestors difficult. And not that it would make my ancestors understanding me difficult, but for me to understand my ancestors difficult. Because it was understood to me that they understand everything you're saying. Even before you think it, they already know what you're thinking. Because spirit is prescient. It's not omnipresent like God, but it is prescient. So it means the very same abilities to see in all tenses of time is there, to know what is going to happen, all of the possible outcomes. Even when people are speaking inside, spirit knows, which is why when you divine, a diviner will tell you what you have come with. There's that deep knowing. So they know whether I speak whatever language, what I'm saying. But if I do not understand the language to its depth, which roots me to the practices of the people and the practices which I have come to use to connect to them, I will miss out on why it is that, how they communicate. And how I've experienced it now is that I always had this thing of, I'm not a dreamer.
Okay.
And because I never used to dream. But now reflecting back 2 years ago, I've started dreaming a lot consistently. And what I've realized is that because now I understand that dreams are allegoric, they are metaphorical, and they follow the structure and shape and form of our African languages, which are also, metaphoric. They also would see, the words can have many meanings. We are born to a similar word based on the intonation. I'm now able to then be able to decipher or to distill the communications from my dreams. So that part will align. But because I wasn't grounded in Isintu and the language, then the dreams to me would have only served to confuse me, because my ancestors understand that because I have a clear cognizant gift. If I don't immediately understand something, I ruminate about it, and I will obsess, and I will pour all of my attention to it. And what my attention was around is not necessarily understanding the dreams, but embodying my gift.
I think, you know, what you're saying raises this point that I've thought of before, and I think a lot of people have thought of before or struggle with even. It's that thing of how ancestors communicate, you know, because people will be told, like, you know, you need to pahle and you know, and ask and speak, but a lot of the time we don't know what kind of communication to expect in return, you know, because when you're not a healer, our understanding is that healers hear words, you know, it was like speaks in words, like you hear a voice in your head, and as a result, people expect, you know, even people abangathwasanga, they expect to hear voices, you know, and so we assume that the issue with language is that it was going to speak in Tsonga, and I don't understand it, and therein is the issue. So I think when you say that dreams are allegorical, then what my understanding of that is that they're going to use context, because they use symbols, because you say that language is attached to culture. So when they use a certain symbol that is attached to their culture and you don't know that symbol, you misunderstand the dream. If they show you a rock, they show you at this age, they show you at that, and you don't understand the cultural context of that. Like, for example, the popular dreams of snakes and rivers and candles and amapai. Well, those are more specific to Bungoma, but you have those dreams that might be, I suppose, maybe even closer to your family rather than your culture. But because you don't understand the family history, you won't know. Like, your family totem could appear in a dream. It could be whatever, a turtle or whatever, but you don't speak that language because you don't know that's your family totem, and it keeps occurring in your dream, and you sort of write it off as, hi, I'm just, you know, it doesn't mean anything. So how did you then go about in immersing yourself in getting cultural understanding while you were knowing the language, but then not knowing the cultural context of the language? How did you go about getting that kind of knowledge?
There's something that's very interesting which you mentioned, you know, around people having this thing where my ancestor will speak Tsonga and as a voice in my head, and I won't understand. And that's a shared experience. With my introduction into expanding into language was I had finished Twasa, and it was about a year after. So I start having these dreams of these songs, and so these songs are in Tsonga, Shangaan, Tonga, because just to be politically correct for everyone. And I'm like, what is happening, you know? And at times I wake up from trance and the ancestors are singing these songs, not saying anything. It goes and it progresses to this lady starting to speak to me in this language. So the strangest thing would happen is that in the dreams, I would understand the language and the entire gist of the conversation. But from the moment I woke up, when I was taking it now from maybe my subconscious to now the cognitive part, to, you know, my mind, like narrating the experience to itself, then my mind would be like, but I don't understand this language. And immediately what the understanding of the dream and what was said would start to run away. And I'd be like, then remember the words, but no longer the understanding. This continued for this was 2015, for a good 6 months, if not a year. And up until the ancestor then, I had a dream where they were like, you know, if you want to understand and you want me to give you this gift, you will have to understand this language. And in that, I started to realize that because I've been having these visions and these dreams and these songs for so long, I actually now understand loosely. And that was my introduction into being able to understand, you know, Tsonga or Shangaan or Tonga, you know, that, and that's how it started. And from that, then I found that also during that time, I had more of a keen interest around songs around it. I discovered what Thomas Chauke, the Shinyori sisters. I really, really fell in love with the culture and the people. I would randomly meet people from Mozambique who identify as Shangaan, and I'd be maybe in a car, in a taxi, and then people would be speaking in Shangaan. So it's like there was an intentional immersion, not just on the dream space, but on the lived experience, which made me have to sort of be like, oh, I actually have contact with this thing, and to be more open. And so it was an organic thing. I didn't then say, no, now I'm going to enroll for Tsonga classes because my ancestor wants for me to learn Tsonga, because the intention is also not to strive, because spirit, leads. Allow for spirit to then show you and take you on the journey that needs to be taken. And I think what is interesting also, when we go back to the communication and how our ancestors, we think that we must phahla indlela thizeni, and how will we understand when they respond to us because we don't understand the language. I think that we need to maybe also go a step back into understanding, how do the ancestors actually communicate, right? So, me, I'm Disetso. I speak all of these languages that I speak. I pass on. In my living memory, that is a collective consciousness, because there's a collection of people who are conscious of my memory, how I was, what I spoke, so that how in however way, now there's YouTube channels, I have this online content I have, which is recorded of all of these things. So that collective consciousness can said to be archived in those things, even in the memories of other people. So when I come back, let's say as an ancestor, and I come back, and maybe because I have a penchant, I love Shangaan songs, and I'll say Shangaan because that's what they identify as from Mozambique, and I come back maybe and I'm singing, one of my favorite songs in a dream to someone. The people around who remain will be able to identify, would see, oh, this is this ancestor, it's Disetso, because he used to like the song, Iwumakule Kamashele, because this, that's tapping into the collective consciousness. So on that level, that for me is the importance of being able to speak maybe the languages of your ancestors, because you also know then the things that they're attached to that they can communicate through you. But on a higher level, beyond speaking around ancestors just then as a shared experience, they are also then guardians, and guides, which means that they then are able to move beyond the language that is tied to their collective consciousness, because when they say that they return elwandle lebangoma maya phansi, it means that they're returning back to the collective unconsciousness where everything is tied together. The collective unconsciousness is what is spoken of, as the primordial waters, the source, whatever way you believe all things are. Embo, also other people speak of it as Embo, waiting abantu want to sivela khona. So that's where they return to, and within there they are all knowing, all understanding. And that's why even though someone could have been just a simple domestic worker, they can come back as a gift-bearing ancestor and be able to give someone messages around, hey, wake up, someone's trying to break into your house. Hey, wake up, go and pray.
What you're actually saying is making me think, especially this particular example of someone who was, let's say, cleaner and comes back as a gift-bearing ancestor, because there's some kind of underlying belief that a gift, an ancestral gift, comes from a person who had some level of prominence, right? Because you're all saying Netlo is powerful, and when I say that, the assumption is that when that person was alive, they were a powerful person. They were a person of prominence. And what you're saying kind of highlights that, to say that it's almost as if there's a difference between me as a person and me as a spiritual being. And it's almost sad because, for a person to have, let's say, maybe not say a powerful, but a wonderful spiritual gift, but then live a life less desirable. It has always made me think, and this question is really part of the questions I want to ask, but it's something I've been very curious about. In your opinion, what is happening in the spiritual realm? Like, let's say, if you were to pass on today, what do you imagine is happening on that side? Like, when you envision the spiritual realm, what do you envision is happening, or what do you see when you visualize it in your head?
Okay, it's so fascinating because I have a immediate response. Now I'm trying to phrase it in a way that will make sense, because to me I speak about it all the time.
Yeah.
So for me, in one level, it's not a singular, firstly, because we are speaking about another dimension. We're speaking about Embo. So in Embo, in the Xhosa, understanding, is a place or a room of requirement, almost like in Harry Potter. So it's a space where anything can be there based on the requirement. It's also a place of creation. What. So it means that, like, for example, when there's thunder, the Xhosa people will have a ritual where they'll bang together pots and we say Embo, so they are sending the thunder back Embo. But at the same time, there's songs that from the Xhosa that speak of Masiye Embo, Lasivela Kona, which is the source of where we come from. So there's this already understanding that from that cosmology that we believe that the other dimension does not have a singular purpose, like the third dimension, where everything is bound, to the realm of ration and logic and gravity. Newton's law. So stepping outside of that, we then can start to say, Khori, for me, it's like, firstly, the other side is literally like in Stranger Things, the upside down world. The upside down.
Yeah.
There's that element of it, right?
And by that, do you mean there's a mirroring?
Yes,
of this world, and there's a similarity to that.
So I believe that for me would be the first layer. The layer within which, if you've just recently passed and everything, that in order as an introduction, because even the spirits go through initiation and rites of passage, which is why maybe we falsely rank ancestors that elamidlozi likhulu or ini instead of saying ukuthi elamidlozi lidala. Because an ancestor, those who have recently passed on, those who are maybe from the 1900s, then somebody can have an ancestor that comes from like the 1st century. That's completely, different. And to get to that level, even as a spirit, one that has been lived and then has carried on as a spirit from the 1st century vis-a-vis one from the 1900s, their exposure and understanding and access into that other dimension where it's a room of requirement will not be the same. Because we understand that if we as humans go through a maturation which allows for us to be able to explore different aspects of living, even then in spirits, because shape follows form, spirit may no longer be bound to physical parameters, but even our souls and our energy is bound to the fact that it needs to go through a certain maturation. So you get to the upside, you are mafigizolo, you go through that thing of maybe like bakfigis, that's an orientation, of welcome to the side in jan, which is why then we have rituals, such as siyazila, we mourn for a certain period. That mourning also is to hold on to that person in our thoughts, and not from a place of, depression or sadness, but holding them in honor and reverence.
Do you reckon that mourning process, that holding in thought, is helping that person on the other side?
definitely it's helping them on the other side, because then it's followed by rituals. There's rituals of there's something that is then released. We then have ceremonies where then when they're brought back into the home. After they brought back into their home, these are rituals we do as Bangoma, Bangoma, even also outside of the Nguni practices. These practices are shared throughout all of the cultures that we have in Africa around these rites of passage of helping the spirit to transition, and then after helping it transition into the spiritual plane, then bringing it also back so that it is still anchored to this physical realm, but then also elevating it beyond its ties and its connections to the material space. So that speaks of Gutsi Jalo Siaba Kupula, the upside thing. You then go into the next realm. Then it is a maturation of the spirit as to, will the spirit start to communicate immediately? Because some people will even start to communicate immediately. Others, it will be like 20 years later, oh, this person passed away 20 years ago, and now everybody's starting to dream about them. What. That journey is much dependent, like us as people. Our rates of maturation and our interests in doing things are different.
So now I know what question I was trying to get at. Now, so you said that when a person passes away, there's still a period where they are sort of linked to the side and they haven't matured in the other side. Are these the people who need language? Are these the people who then necessitate that I need to speak to them Kastswana or Kasezulu because they are still processing communication through that? Because the assumption that I'm making is that the higher up you go as spirit, the less you need. You are more able to speak through spirit, whereas when you're still mafigizolo, you're still requiring language to help you process out. When we use language, like physically speaking, are we more catering to younger spirits than older spirits?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Because even if we go into the construction of language, in linguistics, the languages we speak now, even our Swati, Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, all of our official languages, if maybe you go back 600 years ago,
they didn't exist.
There we go. So definitely the language thing falls away from that natural evolutionary point. But also at the same time, to answer the thing around Bomafigizod, yes, you would definitely speak to them in that language. But the condition for me always is around when you need them. You understand? Is if my father has passed away and my father has not lobolad my mother, and as a result it's creating issues for us because we have to take on the surname as the male children, and in order for us to get jobs. To do this, I must speak to my father, and maybe he insisted on not wanting to do it because of whatever conflict they had. When I go speak to him, am I going to come to him and be like, oh, daddy,
Yo,
bro, what's good? What up? No, obviously, much like, and which is what I always explain to people, much like how just in our normal family dynamics, when you need something from someone that you value and there's a certain sort of a power dynamic. So, of course, I'll watch Desperate Housewives and I'll do everything that would make you more open to the conversation I want to have, especially if it's a difficult one, and is one where I'm putting you out of your comfort zone. And so what young ancestors or Bamafigizolo have is that they've recently passed on. The memories of the things they've done or not done correctly or incorrectly are still attached to living people. They still are traumas, they still represent grief to other people. They still represent loss to other people. So they cannot remove themselves from them because they are still living people who's tied to their collective memory of the things they've done. So they then are still bound to account in a way for those earthly things. So when you communicate with Bumafikizolo, you must come in a way which also then brings them back and calls upon, I liked tea. Upatla kokwako bayatsandza tea. That particular brand of tea, to a memory, to a sensory, to even energy. It calls upon an energy residue of hers which remains in the homestead where she drank that tea.
When you speak of tea, I was having a conversation with someone a while back, and they were asking why we should use alcohol and whatever, and they asked me like, what do I use? And I said, mostly, to be honest, I use tea. Because some people were saying, we use umqombo tea because people used to drink it. So I'm like, there's no black person who didn't drink tea. We drank tea. For me, that's the most standard thing I can have. I can have other things because at the same time, I'm talking to women, women elders, women who did not drink alcohol of any kind, but they drank tea, So what you're saying now is making me think of another sort of challenge that people have when we're communicating with ancestors in that, because now you've mentioned that, people who are young spirits and older spirits and more evolved spirits. So what people generally sort of get confused by is that mangpahla, I get on my knees, I light my candles and whatever. Who am I talking to? Am I talking to, or rather, I don't know if I can say who am I talking to or who's listening. Am I talking to my deceased father? Am I talking to his guides or the family guides? Am I in that hierarchy, who am I talking to? And what is the protocol of listening? Am I speaking to the one who's closest to me, my grandfather, my father, whoever, who then escalates it? And by that I mean, that means that if I'm speaking to someone who's still young, then it means that I have to speak the language that they understand for them to escalate my request. Is that how it works?
I think what is interesting for me here is that what has just come to me is that, the whole thing around people wanting to know when I patla, who am I speaking to?
Yeah.
It touches upon something which is very important for me, around the whole patla culture, because everyone now is a patlist. And though it is great, but in all honesty, meaning to acid, right, I'm a Gobela. But when I need to patla at home, I do not patla because I live with my mom back home. She is the firstborn daughter. Mafungwas, nguyelo patlago. So it means that even then when we are patlering for a twasa that is coming in or anything, I cannot patla in that space when she is there in that home.
Really?
Yeah, understand. That is culturally what is there. I can, when I speak to the ancestors, I patla to inform them, Bokoko says you're in the so. Bokoko says you're in the so. I am informing them, I'm updating them on the things that are happening. That's my communication with them in terms of requests, in terms of things that I desire and what. Those are things that I ask for my mom to patla for me. So the reason I'm mentioning this is that now there's this drive of a lot of people wanting to know, who do I talk to? What do I talk to about? Because there's this emphasis of put everything on Lozi. And what I think we need to be cautious of is, as we speak of these topics, we must also then understand what a crisis everyone patlering in a homestead can actually create.
Really?
There are 10 of us, let's say, in my homestead. Our grandfather was very wealthy. Now all of us are patlists. I want to start a strip club. We all want 10 different things from this one ancestor that we are patlering from. And these things intersect and clash and are in conflict but we are all by birthright connected to this ancestor. We are all calling upon this ancestor daily, every day. We're going to mountains, we're going to rivers. Candles, the works, everything. What is happening energetically in that home? Are we not partnering for conflict? Are we not partnering for intersection? Because our intention does not align, because ukuphatla is all about intention. So if we're all processing 10 different requests with 10 different intentions to one ancestor, then let's say the ancestor rightfully is supposed to respond to this one who's the firstborn daughter. She gets all of those things just as a teaching. The other 9 siblings, our eldest sister, we are tarat. Utati inhlanhla zethu. These are everyday conversations people speak about, conflicts that they go through, all because we are cultivating this thing of all of us wanting to have individual relationships with our ancestors, when there are actually protocols also around who speaks to the ancestors, and this is encoded in our language,
So this is why culturally Umsamo had to be in a specific, like they say, their grandmother's house. That's where Umsamo would be, because it allows for that protocol or that hierarchy to make sure that whatever request that comes is in line with the family's overall wellness, not just mine. Whereas now, because what you're saying is that there's 10 people and each one has their own little corner, and each one is sort of asking for something that is not necessarily in line with how to further the whole family. It only functions for an individual. Sure. Okay. So now I want to talk about how language defines our experiences, or how language captures our understanding of a lot of things. And you've mentioned it before, that language is almost like a library. That's how we access information, through language, right? So in Kastswana or Kasesotho, we call ancestors Badim, right? Which means the ones above, right? Hudimu, Kaudimu, And then Nesinguni, they say Abapants, meaning the ones below. Does that indicate that these two different groups of people had a different understanding of how the spiritual realm functions? If others call them the ones above and the other ones call them the people below, does it mean that they had a different understanding of how the spiritual realm actually functions?
It's always so interesting to me, how we use language in modernity to sort of create an understanding of maybe connection or like difference, right? So how bolela ka Setswana gore na le badimo le modimo, and when you go in, and then you also at the same time go into the creation story of the Tswana people. So badimo and modimo are spoken of as being above, if you're speaking of lihodimo or kohodimo. Yet the creation story speaks of life beginning at the water, at the reeds.
Yeah, by the reeds, yes.
By the reeds. Komatlaking. Matlaka are connected to what? The earth, where all of the life came from. So often what we do, because we are now in this age of modernity where we speak English, is that we always carry our circularism into it, where we have a comparing mind, where if we go into maybe what is esoteric language and we think of as up above, as below, that is a spiritual concept, and it's even represented in that Tswana thing of, yes, the ancestors are both from up above and below, in the same way as in Nguni, you spoke of Uzunguni, it's spoken of Abapants, but also it's also spoken of Indlondlo Yezulu, Emkhathini, Ithunywa Zezulu. So there is also that repetition of the theme of as up above, as below. So there's an understanding that in the language, often we focus on looking at it from a singular sort of a thing instead of weaving it together into a sort of a collected sort of a way of looking at it, of finding, points of commonality.
I think in what you're saying, what is striking me is that I hadn't thought of the whole comparing thing that you're saying, where we use Western thinking and Western language, and then we try to sort of supplant African language into it and say this, or sort of try to make things literal, to say when they said Badimo, they literally meant above, or when they say Abapansi, whereas it was more figurative in the sense that when you say Abapansi, you're basically using the physicality of burying someone to indicate that this is a person who's passed on. When I say Abapansi, I mean those who have laid to rest. Whereas now my Western thinking is saying that I'm implies that what I'm saying when I say Abapansi, I'm saying those who live underground gang. We're literally implying now that what that means is that these are people who literally live underground. And because when I'm taking that literally, that is where then I suppose my conflict comes in. Because if I'm saying I call them Abapansi, what am I implying about them? Like, they're below my feet, they are not in any elevated level. So if I say Abapansi, it makes me less reluctant to engage with them, because my understanding is that they have to be elevated, so that clarifies it. And I think then it causes one to have to think further about how language shapes us, and especially in the sense that when we don't have words for something, what does it mean? You know what I mean? When we do have words for things. So let me break that down to you. I'll start here. I have two questions or two sections I want to cover with this one. One is LGBTQ plus, right? It has, in the past decade or so, it has introduced a lot of words to us, or certain, including certain understandings, like, for example, there's pronouns and they, them, and there's sort of new uses for what I believe has been ancient things, right? So in African, the argument is that we don't have words for that spectrum. So the assumption is that means those things do not exist. Where, in your understanding, vele there were no words for it, or have we lost the words? And if we didn't have the words, does it mean that we didn't know that it exists?
Okay, I love this. So maybe let's start with the one of pronouns, right?
Okay.
So pronouns, again, for me, is another thing which exists particularly in the Western lexical or language, though we reference it in African, but gender and pronouns are not so important. And because we are speaking about spirituality, there's just two pronouns that are used as pronouns for people. So sometimes they'll say umuntu indlondlo and ephaphekhanda. What gender is indlondlo? It can be a man or it can be a woman, because other Gogos who are men are called indlondlo, women are called indlondlo. So it's a they, them. If it had to have a pronoun, we understand Kobela. There isn't a male or a feminine, because it's also a pronoun. So in our languages, because there's an overexpression of them just from those two, ndlondlo, Kobela. So if we looked at it from a pronoun, then it means there's that inclusivity of they, them in our languaging, maybe not in a direct translation from the English of how the pronouns are, but even then in the English from that time, maybe 50 years ago, it didn't exist within the lexical, because language is like culture, it's dynamic, and new language must be created to express new phenomena as it is experienced by people. And when I say new phenomena, it is new because it is experienced by people in a different way, not that it hasn't existed. Maybe then when we go into language, around the naming, I always speak to people around, we can say that homosexuality is an African, it didn't exist and what. And a lot of times we try and argue from this intellectual place, but now I take it from an embodied place. When I went to Twasa, the first thing I got there, and that first night, I said to my Gogo Mkulu, so I want to understand something. Firstly, you see, I have these piercings. I had like an eye piercing and I have these tattoos. How do the Losies feel about that? And she was like, just as you are. If they didn't want it, it wouldn't be there. Then I was like, and secondly, I'm gay. So how do they feel about that? Because I really, really need to know. Because I've always grown up with the understanding that it is very un-African. She said to me that it is not something that's un-African or has not existed. From a language point, when they speak of Ingwenza, they speak of a person who passed away, not having had a husband or a wife, and not having had children. And she said they were called Ingwenza, but it was also Gutlon Pisa as a euphemism, because our language, that's why we don't say Mundu Ufile. Someone has died. That is disrespectful. We say Balele, which is why also we say Abapansi, Abalele. So we have this thing of speaking to euphemize, not because it has shame, but because that is the structure of our African languages. So when they refer to Mundu as Ingwenza, it was understood that these were the individuals, that it would be two gentlemen that lived together, two women that lived together. And she even went so far as saying that even in the ancestors she has initiated in, and from her family there were many people like that. Then she spoke also of Bandulabe Batimbishishaga, people who were also then intersex, people that were there in her family. And she spoke of many identities, And she said to me, but the difference is that because we lived in a time where everyone understood Bundu, Mundu Ngebandu, and that everyone unetindo dake, Bandu would never then focus on other people's business. So you and I could have been lovers and commonplace, lived, cohabitated and what, and there wouldn't have been a need for people to question as to why are those two gentlemen always together? It would be, oh wow, what a great friendship they have, what a great relationship they have, never minding what the nature of the relationship is, but rather focusing on the quality of the relationship. So that was my understanding. And then I went into initiation, how we're learning Dao songs. There's songs that sing of Ndingwenze, Ngwenze again, a reference to, this homosexual identity, expressing Gudiri and Dinamkazi, I don't have a wife, I'm Ndingwenze. And there's a lot of songs within the Ngoma's place, such as in a Nguni song, Yare langwenze, lava gumuka, yare langwenze. So it's a repetitive, like sort of a mentioning, not just from the Ndao, but from also the Nguni we are born. And because even Nanengwenza, when they saying in Swati, Mundu Ingwenza, Mundu Longana Mfati, what in the city they say is Shimani. So in a way, say Uingwenza.
So it wasn't a derogatory term, more of a categorization of a person.
No, it's just to experience, to say this is a person who does not have a partner of the other sex, and we have never seen them with a partner of the other sex or having child with the other sex.
So I'm assuming that was used as a general category, that there was obviously no need to go LGBTQ. You know what I mean? It was just, this is there could be a lot of things happening,
Yeah.
but this is just what we're going to call it, and we're going to leave it at that.
Yes, because also that's also the other thing is that our African languages aren't one thing, like I said, can mean many things. So in English, it's very specified, a table is a table. That's all it is. For example, in our languages, likansi is both a grass mat. Likansi is also sex.
Yeah. So then it is the context.
Also, ukansi is also hlala phansi ukuthi uzilile. Mabathi usecansini, you can be either having sex, either sitting for someone who is dead, or sitting on a grass mat. These are all three totally different sort of experiences, but all in one. So that's why our languages generally don't specify, because they are naturally inclusive.
Sure. Wow. That's really eye-opening.
And I think what I wanted to add, around not just it being mentioned spiritually, is that to those that have initiated in Sunguni Nesindao, they also understand the elevation, particularly of the Ngwenza spirit. So it's not an ancestor that is just, it's one of those. But when someone has Idlotile Ngwenza, it is known to be a particularly difficult spirit, and a spirit which must be given attention, because it is also equally extremely gift-bearing. Okay. So there's a reverence also attached to it, and an extra sacredness in how it is even treated.
Really?
There are specific rites of passages that are done when Mundu Atwasa Sinzawe, which particularly has to do with Ingwenza in a similar fashion to Inzunza. So if I had to maybe rank, I would say Ingwenza and Inzunza are placed in terms of the same sort of level of importance should a person have that as part of the Ndawo gifting.
So in sort of speaking of this, of whether if we have a language for something or a word for something, does it mean that we know it or we don't know it? In the past episode, I spoke to Gogo Mahlodi, and she was talking about, she wanted to know whether or how ancient Africans treated depression, right? And I was like, the first issue is going to be language when you want to understand the history of depression in African history, because the first thing is going to be, what did we call it? If you were to try to pinpoint it. So then the question is, if whatever we would have called it would indicate what kind of ailment it is, right? Because it's depression, we know that in our understanding of English, we know that it's a mental thing, but it could have been called something that implied that this is a spiritual thing, So in your understanding, for the fact that in your understanding of languages, if we don't have words like depression, or, well, I don't want to say anxiety because I think there are words for that. If we didn't have a word for depression, does it mean that we didn't know of it, or we had a different understanding of it and therefore called it something else?
So it's interesting that I always hear a lot of people speak around what exists or doesn't exist in African languages. And like you're saying, it's both something which can be true when it comes to things which have been invented, but to anything which has to do with the human condition and things that the human condition will take us through, whether it's on a mental, spiritual, or physical level, all of it exists in our African languages. Perhaps what is the difficulty is, like earlier I was mentioning, is that we want to frame things in our lexical and our cognition from a English, framing, from a Western framing. So depression within itself, if we aren't given the meaning of it, you won't know actually what depression is. It doesn't have a literal meaning. It has a connotative meaning, which has been given as a definition. It's a defined meaning, right? You are sad. You come in. ke nkare moya wa gago a se sharp. A week goes on. What's ever since last week o bona gore moya wa gago a se sharp, mara gona bjalo ka o bona ka re moya wa gago o botlhoko. Moya, because moya to us is the breath. Moya to us is the divine. Moya to us is our ancestors. Moya to us is also our spirit. All of the things which depression takes us through, because people go through spiritual crisis when they depress and awakenings. People go through emotional states. People then think back to, their traumas, how they grew up, which is their ancestors. People think just about themselves and how they lived experience and their narrative. Your soul, all of these things called moya, which when someone is not feeling okay, we say marakar moya wa mutho. Someone passed away or something happens. Hi kikwile man gore moya wa gagwe ne ntse se le sharp last ke mon. So that is what depression to us is. Depression is not something that is inherent, that we think is an inherent external thing that comes. We understand it as something that could take any shape or form, but it is what we focus on, what it is actioned towards, which is that it affects moya wa gago. Moya wa kagabi, right? So even then in how we dealt then with depression, that's such a beautiful question, especially when we're speaking about language, is that it is in our language, it is in how everything is around song being part of how it is that is engraved in any of our rites of passage as African people. Any event in actual African indigenous people's lives is song and dance. From life to death, there's always song and dance. And the qualities of what song and what dance represents are able, even in, cognitive behavioral therapy as a complementary sort of a practice. Singing and artistic things and dance are encouraged because of the ability that they have, to alter your physical state and your emotional state, your mental state, and also to be able to allow for your brain to pump oxygen, giving, blood in there, and for all of those great things to happen. This is a scientific fact. This is how we dealt with depression. We sing, we sit around.
Because with depression, there's an element of isolation that it breeds.
Yes, right. We, in the homestead, the familial structure, we always emphasize this coming together around a central place, whether it was boys alone or girls alone, and it was not from a gendered point of thing because it's a misogynistic thing. It's because there's certain things which you feel in a safe space, in a safe container, if you're a woman alone, to speak about certain things. Imagine how embarrassing it will be that I've been depressed because I started bleeding and you don't know what's going on in to somebody who doesn't have an object like yours. It's to create that feeling of, a safe container. You sit by the fire. At the fire, what are we doing? It's a circle, a sacred circle, where we can have what? Inquiry, a check-in, where in that inquiry, the elders who are there will guide the inquiry to sense and feel into what is going on there, to also then be able to sit then when they are doing, to then make plans as to how can we make sure that there is a coexistence within here. So it's an embodied way within it, and it's one way we called upon community, we called upon just being able to understand that this is not anyone can go through anything that will afflict moya wa gagwe. What is important is not what has caused my depression, but whatever it is, in kwisile botlhoko mo moyeng, and the first thing would always be that people must speak. So the culture we're in now, we grow up in a culture where a lot of us think, Africanness is not around speaking, you don't share because you grew up in those contexts. But that's not true when we go into indigenous spaces where baphila setso. If you go into your deepest rurals, you'll find homesteads where they sit around the fire. The reason why women go to the river to go and collect water and get firewood is because they can come of all various ages to speak about women's issues in safe spaces. Boys go to the mountains, to the cows of all ages with elder men so that they can share all of their experience. There's a constant cultivation of the culture of sharing, which is driven by the language of speaking all around. Unjani, uvuka njani, ulele njani.
You know, what's striking is that in our understanding of depression, and you know, depression is a disease, depression is, you know, a kind of illness. In what you're describing, it approaches depression from a human perspective, as not as a sickness, not that you're sick, but you are a person who is not well. And that's for, like, you start first with the person themselves, like moya wako phansi. And by that you sound quiet. There's always almost like that literal interpretation, like umoya wako phansi, you're very down. And then that's the first layer, and then, you know, umoya wako phansi, meaning your spirit. So, and you, like you say, you could say it like the third time, meaning that your whole being is down. So there is that, even though the language doesn't specify with the same words, you are tending to different aspects of a person. So now here's where my concern is, yeah, is that whether we like it or not, language is evolving, right? Like you said, 500, 600 years ago, whatever it is we're speaking now didn't exist. We don't even know what the people spoke. Maybe history will say we spoke a Proto-Bantu language. It's difficult to know. We can't hear it. We don't know what that even sounded like. We can suspect that it had similarities to what we're saying now, but we don't know. We don't know what the Sotho language, the Nguni language, we don't know what it sounded like. And so now we are in a space where, you know, those of us who have kids, we're realizing that through them, language is also evolving, in that, you know, they're speaking less of our languages. And we are sort of meant to, we believe that there has to be cause for concern that our kids are not speaking their languages. And the concern is, what will that mean for their spirituality? In that, if our kids are speaking, if I'm speaking half the language that my parents spoke, and my child speaks half the language that I am speaking, they will function on a quarter of the language. What does that mean for their spiritual well-being, or rather their spiritual future even? You know, will that mean that our children will be less spiritual? Will they engage less because they will have less words? And I think where the negative aspect of it is that we're talking about depression, in that having lost the conception of depression as umoya wako phansi, in that it's not a mental thing, it's a physiological thing. In not having those words, it will only ever be relegated to a mental sickness that needs medication, that needs therapy, and that needs something external for you. And it's not, you know, does it mean that we are going generations down the line, we are getting increasingly more sick spiritually?
No, I don't think so. If I'm honest, you know, there's this constant erasure and erosion, you know, narrative that we have as Indigenous people. And I'm on the view of spirituality is on the rise. Spirituality is finding its way into new age language. You know, people will screw speak of chakra hands. When we were that age, 19, we didn't know what a chakra was. A general, but now it's part of everyday conversation. You go on to TikTok, you see someone with sage, money loves me, money comes to me, money follows me, money whatever. Yeah. That sage, maybe not having the language of the people and whatever, the ritual and the intention of what it's purposed for still continues. And if we're honest, there's by far, when it comes to a cultural visibility of Indigenous expressions of spirituality, I don't think ever in history there's been such an embracing from your celebrities to your business to your government. There's just a whole embrace. I mean, mandates from the UN around looking into indigenous knowledge systems as solutions to contemporary living issues, things like this from UNESCO being part of the Sustainable Development Goals. Indigenous knowledge is something which has been prioritized. You look into your promulgation of your yoga, your mindfulness movement, just those two coming from Eastern mysticism. It's a whole culture. Chinese medicine, it's a whole culture. Even things such as Ifa, it's a whole culture. You go into tarot, it's a whole culture. You go into even what's the other things? But all of these indigenous expressions are forming part of our everyday mainstream living. And whether or not they carry the language of the originators, it doesn't matter, because those languages are not the original languages, but they still carry the intention and the purpose and the connection to a point of identity and expression. So I'm not very much worried whether the language my great ancestors will patla me in will be even this English language I'm speaking in. What I'm excited about is that they will be able to go and see now whatever is there that I would have left behind, and be able to be like, okay, so this is what we can call upon from this person in whatever way we are able to call upon. The rise of digital media and how basically things are going to be there forever unless some great catastrophe happens. But we're archiving, we're still remaining authentic to our origin. So even the remnants of that language, which is important, should it be important, will also still be accessible. This idea of having something that we will lose now, for me, doesn't exist, because so long as we are recording and we are archiving, we're creating these conversations, nothing can ever be lost again.
Is it time to introduce Itagazelo in English?
One thing I will say is that the importance in all of the evolution of our languages is that there's a certain sonic or phonetic structure that they take. And if you notice, indigenous languages or older languages that are spoken by what could be said to the first people, you find points of intersection in terms of the sonic structure and the sounds and how the sounds come through. Like, for example, in Buddhism, you do the Om meditation. When you go into a lot of stunya and chants and everything, you experience a lot of the Om sound coming through and it being repeated as a meditation to get to an altered state. Even dueting ngoma temadloti. So there are certain sounds, even like ma, there's a lot of repetition in those languages, because the vibration of the sonic structure of them are important to activate certain sort of parts in ourselves and portals if it has to do with other dimensions and other realms. So I think what is important is that we must keep Itagazelo, because for now they have a certain quality. That's why even when somebody Itagazelas themselves, even if it's not your own,
you get the shivers.
You get it's the vibration of how they are sonically structured. And if we can be able to do that, because we do experience in English when somebody maybe is doing a praise or a poem where you get a similar feeling. So if you can still encapsulate that, for me, it's not an issue, because you will still always have Busi, okay, sine mabuza besinana tila sithi mshengu shabadala tonga la mavuso lo phana wulo wakwadla beta mundu. But maybe nyalo we're saying, you who come from where. But it's both. And I think it goes again back to that whole thing of having to maybe look into, why is it that we feel we need to hold on to something that is naturally evolving in order for our spirituality to actually have meaning and be real to us.
during the mid-1st century, during a period called the Roman exile, Jewish people were dispersed from the ancestral homeland of Israel and forced to settle in other parts of the world, mostly Europe. It was during this time that Jewish people's historic language of Hebrew began to die out, specifically as a spoken language. After that, Hebrew only existed as a written liturgical language. This means that it was only used in sacred texts or during church services, but by and large, no one actually spoke the language in daily life. So for basically 2,000 years, Hebrew as a spoken language was considered a dead language. But that was until the early 19th century. What started happening was that some Jewish authors living in Europe began to use Hebrew in their books and novels. This caused a lot of controversy because at the time there were a lot of Orthodox Jews who believed that Hebrew was a holy language and could never be used to write contemporary literature. But it was during the formation of the country that we know today as Israel that things got serious for the language. What started happening was that many different Jewish people from different regions began to arrive and live alongside Jews who had already been living in the region of what we call today Palestine. Enter a man called Eliezer ben Yehuda, who moved to Palestine in 1881 and was one of the main pioneers who not only advocated for the establishment of a Jewish state, but also for the use of Hebrew as a bridge to unite the different Jewish people from the different places who were mostly speaking different languages and dialects. It is said that Ben Yehuda started the process of reviving Hebrew by publishing a newspaper in that language. But the funny thing is that back then, the Hebrew language did not have a word for newspaper. This pointed to the issue of the language itself needing to be updated. So Eliezer ben Yehuda began to invent new words based on the roots of ancient Hebrew, Arabic, and Canaanite languages. And what he did was that at the back of his newspaper, he had a list of words that were in the news stories that people didn't know, and he went and explained what those different words were in the newspaper. He ended up putting together a committee which discussed which words were needed. Like doctors discussed what words were needed in relation to medicine, scientists discussed scientific words, mathematicians, biologists, all of those people. Over time, thousands of new words were added to the language, and together with his wife, Hemda, Ben Yehuda began to put together the first Hebrew dictionary. It is said that Ben Yehuda was so strict with regards to Hebrew with his own family and friends that at some point his family was the only family that spoke Hebrew. Apparently, his firstborn son was not allowed to play with other kids out of fear of him learning other languages besides Hebrew. Eliezer ben Yehuda's movement grew into the establishment of the first strictly Hebrew school. He believed that it was imperative for the Hebrew language to spread primarily from the schools into the homes of Jewish people. In 1948, having been a language that had no known speakers for almost 2,000 years, Hebrew became one of the two official languages of Israel and today has millions of first language speakers. There are about 7,000 languages in existence today. Half of the people in the world speak 50 of those languages, and some studies say that around 80% of the world's languages that we have today will be extinct in the next 50 years. Some linguists say that the loss of languages is akin to the loss of biodiversity in nature. It becomes easier for sickness to spread within that system. When a people lose their language, especially if it happens rapidly or abruptly, it can lead to sociological illnesses because the people find it difficult to relate not only to the world outside, but to each other and with themselves. Personally, I think that African spirituality shifts somewhat when the language changes. I think it loses depth in some ways, but at the same time, language will always be going through changes. The story of the resurrection of the Hebrew language points to a deeply complex process that requires a tremendous amount of sacrifice, not just on a personal level, but also on a societal level too. Let's just imagine for a moment that isiZulu was to disappear completely today and only exist in the Zulu Bible, meaning that the only time you would hear isiZulu would be in the context of the church during prayers, and it would be considered blasphemy to speak isiZulu outside of the church. What kind of change would that bring to Zulu culture or the Zulu sense of identity? Personally, I don't think that the Zulu language would be resurrected 2,000 years from now, because I don't think Zulu people will exist 2,000 years from now. In the same way that Zulu people did not exist 2,000 years ago. I don't think any culture that we have today will exist in the year 4022. By then, we will exist as a moment in history, a memory. What will exist, however, is spirituality and the spiritual realm. And maybe that shows that spirit, in a very fundamental way, is beyond language. My name is Vusumzinqande. Thank you so much for joining me on yet another episode of The Journey Kwantu. And I hope that I have given you something to think about, something to ponder, because this is a very complex topic. It could take multiple episodes just to scratch the surface, but thank you for joining me. I wish you light, I wish you courage, and I wish you all the very best on your journey. Makwande.